Hello, friends. How's everyone doing? It is such a pleasure to be back here. My name is Fanny Chu, the host, and it's Monday, and not just any Monday. It is Marvelous Monday. Today is our third installment of Portland Cocktail Week and USPG's Masterful Management Series, sponsored by Kettle One Vodka. Thank you so much for joining us today. Super excited for today's class because, like most of you, the P&L lingo is super foreign to me, and I'm always like, huh? Whenever I sit in those meetings. And that's why Margot Block is here to help us understand the basics. So here's a little itty bitty on her if you didn't know. Margot has worked in the industry for over the past 13 years in various financial and operational roles. She earned her MBA from UCLA Anderson. She's originally from Boston and home is on the West Coast, where she transitioned out of operations and now runs a financial consultancy in the City of Angels. Her business helps restaurants bridge the gap between finance and operations. When she ain't crunching numbers, you can find her chilling with her pup gazpacho. Oh my God, what a cool name, Chilled Soup. I love pups. Hi, Margot. What kind of
Hi,
pup and how are you?
Thank you for the intro. I'm well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Right on. So are we.
Thanks. So I think, Fanny gave you a little bit of background on who I am and where I'm coming from. And I mentioned this earlier. When I had my first GM job, I couldn't have told you what a P&L was, let alone how to manage it. So my goal today is really just to start high level, keep it simple. What are sort of the broad brushstrokes of how you guys can think about and understand a P&L? And then you can always dig in and dive deeper from there.
Yeah. I'm sure everyone's super pumped to hear learn all about P&L from you.
P&Ls are really fun, guys. You're going to come away from this just really enjoying financials.
Yeah, let's get started.
All right, awesome. All right, so Dave, if you want to go ahead with the first slide. And again, guys, feel free to ask questions and stop me as we go. But before we really dig into the components of a P&L, I just wanted to take a minute and talk to you about the P&L versus a balance sheet. If you've ever been in a management meeting for your bar or restaurant, I'm sure you've heard those terms thrown around. So let's just take a beat. What is a P&L? Well, it stands for profit and loss. And at the end of the day, it's really capturing your revenue or your sales minus all of your expenses. And what's left over is either profit, hopefully, and occasionally loss. Another thing that I'll go over a lot today is there's just a lot of synonyms used in our industry. And so I think that can also be intimidating for people. When you're in a meeting, your boss or your managers are at the table, they might be referring to the same thing, just using different words. So I'm going to just try to sprinkle those in throughout this conversation today, because I think that also helps you realize, oh, okay, hold on a second. We're all talking about the same thing here. So a P&L, one of the key differences to a balance sheet is that it's showing profitability over a period of time. And that period of time can be a day, it can be a week, it can be a month, or it can be a year. And it's really depicting key operations or, the things that you need to spend money on to run your day-to-day business. A P&L, speaking of synonyms, is also known as an income statement. So if you hear one or the other, they're exactly the same thing. The flip side, and what we won't really get into today, is the balance sheet. And so the balance sheet is taking all of your bar or restaurant's assets, so things like large equipment, your liquor inventory, cash in your bank account. Those are big assets for your company. And then on the other side of your balance sheet are things like liabilities and equity. So liabilities are going to be, sales tax payable, payroll taxes payable. If you have a loan from the bank, that's going to be a liability for your company because you are ultimately liable for those expenses. And then the other piece of the puzzle is equity. And equity is basically any net income, so any profit left over from prior months or prior years is going to go directly into equity or the value of your business, and any investment in your business. So a lot of times I'm sure you guys have seen investors are going to contribute, $50,000, $100,000 to basically start up the bar or restaurant. All of that constitutes equity or a piece of ownership in that business. So in contrast to P&L, the balance sheet really shows the overall health of your business, but it's only a snapshot in time. So if you were to pull your balance sheet today, Monday, June 14th, okay, it's going to give you this kind of preview of the overall health of your business as it stands today. The balance sheet also goes well above daily operations. So as a manager, you're probably not going to have a lot of interaction with the balance sheet. You're going to probably mostly work with your P&L. But I always think it's important just to talk about it, because when you think about the overall health of your business, as an owner, as a potential investor, there are things that can reflect the health of the business that live on the balance sheet that might not necessarily be very evident just by looking at the P&L. So just a high level P&L versus balance sheet to start. But now let's dig in a little bit more to what actually goes into your P&L. All right, so you guys have probably heard a lot of these before, but again, I'm going to just take you through, everyone feel comfortable on, okay, when they talk about this, what are we actually dealing with here? So in your P&L, most importantly, some might argue, is going to be your top line. It's going to be your revenue or your sales for whatever period of time you're looking at your P&L. It's also going to include your COGS or your cost of goods sold. And we're going to really dig into COGS and labor a bit today. And then on the session this afternoon, we're really going to dig into COGS. So again, we're going to give you kind of the quick hits, but any of these subjects, you could do a lesson on each one of these, but I'll spare you. Okay, so then you have labor. And in a restaurant and bar, those two are really going to be two of your largest expenses, your COGS and your labor. But we can't forget about everything else on the P&L. So next we have operating expenses. And again, going back to those synonyms, some people might call it operating expenses. Some people might call it controllables. Some people might call it variable expenses. The reason you might hear controllables is because as a manager, these are essentially expenses that are within your control. And they're also called variable expenses because they tend to fluctuate as your sales fluctuate. So if sales go up, utilities is an example of an operating expense. All right, you're using more gas, you're using more power, your utilities is going to go up as well. Another example of operating expenses might be, paper goods or cleaning supplies, things like that again are really directly related to your sales volume. Linen is another really good example, small wares, things like that. The other category of expenses that you probably will see on your P&L is called SG&A, and it stands for Selling, General, and Administrative. This one is also known as non-controllables or fixed expenses. So again, we think of non-controllables because as a manager, these are often things that you really can't control or you can't manage to. Oftentimes, they're expenses that are set by the owners. And again, they're also called fixed expenses because regardless of your sales volume, these things don't tend to fluctuate. So if you think about a monthly valet service, Sometimes it's a fixed expense, regardless of how many people are using the service. Or credit card fees, you're going to be charged a consistent percentage, regardless of how much volume you do. Things like marketing and PR, sometimes those budgets are also just fixed monthly contracts that, again, don't fluctuate with sales as much, and also are a lot of times predetermined by owners and are outside of your control as a manager. And then we have occupancy and rent. And again, beyond just your base monthly rent, we call it occupancy because sometimes there will be things like general liability insurance in there, taxes, licenses, and fees. If you share common areas with other restaurants or bars or shops, there might be some common area fees. And so occupancy and rent is obviously, it's not something that we think about on a daily, weekly basis. And we probably never think about it during service, but it is a pretty large chunk of change on your P&L. And as I'm sure everyone has noticed over the past year, even though it's a fixed expense, when we have something like, this is an extreme, but COVID, a lot of folks have, I'm sure, gone back to your landlords and have started to renegotiate and figure out, okay, how can we work with you and how can you work with us, given the fact that our sales are nowhere near what we expected them to be. And then we have at your bottom line, net income. And so I think this is as important as revenue or sales. And again, this is a synonym for net profit or net loss. And so again, it is income, it is profit, it is loss, net of all of the expenses that we just talked through. So that's a very important one. All right, so let's dig in a little bit more. All right, so if we think about revenue, and again, I think it's very easy to kind of overcomplicate and dig in, but for purposes of today, I really want to start everybody off on a pretty high, broad brushstroke understanding. So at a very basic level, when you see that revenue dollar amount on your P&L, don't get intimidated by the spreadsheet. Don't get intimidated by the dollar signs versus the percentage signs. At the end of the day, the two main factors that are driving your revenue are two things that you guys as managers are constantly aware of and monitoring. So this is your check average, or how much money every guest, every customer that walks in your door is spending, multiplied by how many people are coming in your door. And again, this can be over a day, it can be over a week, it can be over a year. But at the end of the day, those are the two fundamental levers that you as a manager can play with to actually affect or drive revenue. So I'm sure everyone's been in meetings when we talk about, okay, what can you do to upsell? What can you do to turn customers faster, to get more in the door? And how do you continue to drive that check average or that number of guests? Things like seasonality also have a huge impact on revenue. I used to run a bunch of ice cream shops in LA. We would do double our sales in summer than we would in winter. So you also want to think about, okay, how does seasonality drive and affect revenue? Things like day parts and days of the week. Are you a dinner only? Are you an evening only? Or are you breakfast, lunch, and dinner? And are you 7 days a week or are you 5 days a week? So you always want to think about, okay, how are all these things coming into play? And then I like to call out my boring but important principles so as not to put you guys all to sleep, is this notion of revenue recognition. And all that is to say is that from the purposes of accounting and the purposes of P&L is you're only going to recognize or report revenue when you've actually exchanged a good or a service. So in this case, if I come into Fanny's bar and I buy a cocktail, I give her money, she gives me a cocktail. That's an exchange of her primary business, her primary goods and services, right?
Mhm.
But if I come into her bar and I buy a gift card, I've given her money, but she hasn't actually given me her primary goods or services, right? She's just given me a gift card. And so we're going to basically, let's say I give her $100 and I get a $100 gift card. Going back to that balance sheet now, nothing gets reported on the P&L, but the gift card gets booked on my balance sheet. And it basically says, hey, you have a liability now because somebody gave you $100, but you haven't given them anything yet. So it's going to sit there on the balance sheet until I come back in and I say, okay, Fanny, I'm going to buy $100 worth of cocktails and I'm going to pay for it with my gift card. Now you are giving me your primary good or services. You're giving me those cocktails. Okay, now is the time that we're going to report or recognize that revenue on her P&L. And at that point, she's made good on her $100 liability. She's exchanged services. So that $100 gift card liability is going to come off the balance sheet. It's going to go back down to zero because I've redeemed it. All right. So that's a sneak peek into revenue. And then let's keep going and dig into probably everybody's favorite next to labor lately, cost of goods sold. So let's start with this boring but important principle because I think it ties in well with revenue recognition. So this boring but important principle is the matching principle. So in a very similar fashion to we don't want to report or record revenue until we've actually exchanged those goods or services. With our cost of goods sold, think about if you had a monthly P&L. The matching principle is saying, okay, your cost of goods sold or your purchases and your inventory that's reported for that month, it has to match the sales for that month. So saying that another way, if I'm selling pizzas and I record $100 worth of sales of that pizza or those pizzas, at the same time I get credit for the sales of $100, I need to make sure that I'm also taking the hit or I'm recording the expense for my raw ingredients or my cost of goods that went into making those pizzas. So that's the matching principle. If I get credit for the sale or the revenue, I have to make sure that my expenses or my cost of goods are matching for that same period of time, whatever it is, a day, a week, a month. So let's break this down a little bit further. Because I think a lot of times folks get presented with that giant P&L, and it's usually in Excel, and it's really freaking intimidating, and you kind of just see a wave of numbers. So we're going to work our way down. So revenue and sales is always going to be at the top. And now if you kind of scan your eyes down, you're going to see a cost of goods or a COGS line item. And there's going to be a dollar amount and there's going to be a percentage with it. But where on earth does that dollar amount come from, right? So if you have a bookkeeper on staff or anybody, an accountant who's doing your monthly books, I'm sure they've hounded you for invoices. And I'm sure you've also been hounded to make sure that you're doing inventory, whether it is once a month, whether it's more frequent, less frequent, it always depends on your own operation. Well, here's why this is important. You're going to basically calculate your total cost of goods. And again, let's just stick with a monthly P&L for a second. by taking your starting inventory, so your total inventory on hand at the beginning of the month, your full bottle count, let's say, and then you're going to add any additional purchases that you bought during that month. So it could be a case of wine, it could be 10 cases of wine, and we'll just stick with wine for a second to keep it simple. But you're not necessarily using all of the bottles of wine that you purchased during that month for that month's worth of sales. Many of those bottles will stay in inventory for weeks or months and then be used for future sales, right? So we want to also give you back the credit of, hey, you bought a bunch of wine, but you didn't necessarily use it. So we do starting inventory plus purchases, everything you bought, minus ending inventory. What's everything that you had left over at the end of the month? Because again, if we think about that matching principle, you haven't sold it yet, so it's not reported as revenue. You shouldn't take the hit for it just yet. You should get credit for the fact that it's still in your inventory. So here's just a really easy example, because I really like simple math, to prove a point. So let's say every bottle of wine is worth $10 at cost. So in the first scenario, you'll have $10 plus $30 equals $40 minus $20. So your total COGS for the month is $20, right? But let's say in the second scenario, you have $30 worth of inventory. You buy $20, so you have $50, but you only have one bottle left over. Well, now your total COGS for the month and the number that's going to show up on your P&L is $40. Again, in this scenario, that's chump change, right? That's nothing. But we just moved a couple of bottles around and you essentially just doubled your COGS for the month, going from 20 to 40. So if you add a couple extra zeros on there, you can see how quickly mismanagement of your cost of goods, mismanagement of your purchases, if you're not really good about, hounding vendors for invoices, maybe you're not working the shift when some cases are delivered, that invoice disappears. It's really important to make sure you are tracking all of your expenses so that these numbers don't kind of fly all over the place and they go up and they go down because maybe you missed an invoice or two, or maybe you miscounted inventory one month, or you have different people counting inventory and they're not trained to take it the same way. So we always want to make sure that we're as consistent as possible from month to month to make sure that those numbers are really the same. All right, so let's keep rolling. Hopefully I haven't lost everybody yet. Good? Okay.
Yes.
The next thing I want to just call out for folks on this call is gross profit versus prime costs. So in general, almost every other industry that I've ever come across is really tied to gross profit. And gross profit is just the calculation of taking your revenue or your sales minus your cost of goods. That's what gross profit is. But for us, we get to be in an industry that, as I mentioned before, relies on a lot of labor. And so it's not really helpful for us to just focus on gross profit and just focus on COGS. It's really important that we also manage to labor and everything that goes along with that, because COGS and labor combined are known as prime costs. And if you think about it, they are the primary expenses of any bar or restaurant. They're going to be the two largest expenses 9 times out of 10 that you are working with on your P&L. And so for us, a lot of times prime cost is actually a much, much more helpful indicator of a restaurant or bar's health than just gross profit. And just food for thought, a healthy restaurant's prime costs are typically between 60 to 70%. So what we're saying here is that you only have 30 to 40% left over to cover everything else that we just went through in that P&L. Those operating expenses, those fixed costs, that rent. And so it's really important that we manage cost of goods and labor as closely as possible. Typically what I'll see for restaurants, and this will be a little bit lower for bars, is prime costs in a healthy restaurant are usually 60 to 70%. So another way of saying this is for every dollar that comes in to your bar or to your restaurant, 60 to 70 cents of that dollar goes immediately to COGS and labor. 30 or 40 cents, and let's just say your prime costs are 70 cents, right? 70%. If you give away 70 cents to COGS and labor, well, then you have 30 cents left over for every dollar to pay for everything else on your P&L. So to say that these are very important to manage is probably an understatement. All right, so I know we're running short on time, so let's do one or two more slides if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So again, we'll go quickly through this. What is included in labor? Well, it's your hourly wages, it's your management salaries, but don't forget, it's also all your benefits and insurance. So it's things like workers' comp, it's payroll taxes, if you have a sick or vacation policy, and then insurance, that's all going to go into labor. So that's another super important thing to make sure that we are managing. Okay, and I'll also say quickly on points versus efficiencies, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys right now, so bear with me. Think about $30 worth of labor on $100 of sales. So scenario 1 on the slide. That means that your labor percentage is 30%. So for, again, $100 in sales, 30% of it, or $30, is going directly towards labor. But let's say you kept that same level of sales. You had $100 in sales, but you were able to get more efficient. Maybe you shaved some labor, maybe you cross-trained some folks, and you were able to get labor down to $25 for the same amount of sales. Well, now you've become more efficient. You've gained 5 points in efficiencies because now you've gone from 30% labor to 25% labor. Same amount of sales, but you were able to cut your labor dollars. Versus, I think what happens a lot of times for us is your sales go up and your labor goes up. Mm-hmm. And then if you're not paying attention, you lose all of those efficiencies. So let's say in scenario 3, your sales go up to $133. Great. But now instead of $30 of labor, you added $10 in additional labor. So now you're spending $40 on labor. Well, the problem is your labor percentage, or labor as a percentage of sales, is still the same. You're back at 30%. So the goal as you think about managing your labor is always think about, okay, what's my labor percentage, but also what's my dollar spend on labor? Because anytime sales go up, you don't want to immediately increase labor. You want to really think about, hey, how can we continue to keep labor lean so that we can gain those efficiencies and we can gain those extra points? Because guess what? Those extra points, they go straight to your bottom line. They go straight to your net income. So that's a huge opportunity. All right. Let's keep rolling. So high level summary of what we've talked about today. I just like the visuals. And again, if you're looking at that Excel sheet or, whatever P&L report your company is providing you, don't be overwhelmed. At the end of the day, the names might change a little bit. The geography of where things fall might change a little bit, but this is the core P&L. You've got your revenue and sales, which is always your top line. You've got all your expenses, your cost of goods and labor, the biggest ones for us, in addition to OpEx and fixed expenses and rent. And then you have your bottom line. You have your net income. So if we go to, I think it's the next slide, and let's actually, we're going to just do this really quickly. Again, just a reminder that your net income is your revenue less expenses, or your profit or your loss. And I think here's another area where folks will get intimidated by terminology. What's the difference between income and net income? Net income is income net of expenses. So again, it's that bottom line number after everything else is accounted for. And then I just think this is always so interesting to keep in mind. No two bars or restaurants are the same, but I do think it's important to know the average restaurant net income in the US is 6%, and the average bar net income is 15%. Now, you may very well see 10 points higher, 10 points lower, but those are your general ballparks. So again, that means for every dollar that comes in your bar, 15 cents is what's left over after you've accounted for all of those expenses. So we have a very, very low margin, which means that it's extremely important for us as owners and operators to really understand these numbers and really dig in and get comfortable learning how to manage these metrics. Because if you have one broken fridge or freezer, that's literally could be the difference between profit and loss for a given month. All right, and then next slide, I just want to get to one final slide that gives you a good, yep, this is it. Okay, so last but not least, these are just some numbers that are pretty typical, and this is a restaurant example, which is why you see that net income of 7%. If you have revenue of $100, and again, I like to keep my examples small in scale because I think it's just easier to kind of wrap your arms around it. But again, add a couple zeros onto this and the money's moving very quickly, right?
Yep.
So you have $100 on a ticket, you're giving away $30 are going directly to cost of goods. And again, these are averages, so it's always going to change based on your specific model. You're giving away $35 typically for labor. So now you've given away $65 of that $100 to your prime costs. Then let's give $10 to your operating expenses, $9 to your SG&A, your non-controllables, your fixed expenses. And then let's give $9 to occupancy and rent because maybe your landlord didn't feel like negotiating that day. So now you've given away all of your $100 to cover your expenses except for $7. So if you add a couple zeros on there, let's say you're doing $100,000. Okay, now we're talking about $7,000 in net income. So each point or each percentage point is extremely important. If you go back to our labor example that we just went through, let's say instead of 35% labor, we were able to be more efficient as our sales grew, and we actually got labor to 30%. Well, now you've shaved 5 percentage points off of labor, and that goes straight to your bottom line. So now your net income just went from 7% to 12%. So I know I just threw a lot at you guys, but hopefully this has just made everyone so excited to dig in and learn more about P&Ls and financial management.
That was awesome.
Thank you for staying with me.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Margot, for making everyone's Monday masterfully manageable and marvelous. Thank you again, Kettle One, USBG, and Portland Cocktail Week for all you do for our community. And to all you lovely heads out there, I really appreciate you for taking the time out for joining us today. Thanks a million. If you enjoyed this class, please do me a solid and hit the like or love button and or show some love in the comments below. And if you want to see more Marvelous Monday classes like this one, follow Portland Cocktail Week on Facebook. We have new classes on Mondays and an archive of past classes on the video tab here. For folks who aren't on Facebook, we are posting these videos on YouTube, PDXCW as well. We're also on Instagram at PDXCW, so you can find out what's up and coming there. Thank you, Dave. So speaking of next, I'm sure a lot of you out there are looking to build the perfect bar team. Well, don't you fret, my pets. Next week for the last class of our Masterful Management series. Oh no, it's our last class already. Oh my God, does time fly by fast when you're having a blast. We're going to have Rachel Ramsey joining us to enlighten us on hiring and training your staff. When you tune in next Monday at the same time, till then, have a marvelous rest of the day, folks. Peace, love, drink marvelously. Mandalorian signing off.
Thanks, everyone.